The panel today is on founding teams. And before I introduce the moderator, I want to take a moment to introduce Mary Moon Burnham. She is with the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies and was the co-organizer of the event tonight. So part of the opportunity to get to be here tonight is to be able to introduce Joel Hyatt, who is well known by reputation. He was the founder of Hyatt Legal Services and Hyatt Legal Plans, and is also a lecturer with Business School.
Thank you very much, Sandy, and thank you, Mary. And I want to add my welcome on behalf of the Software Development Forum and the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies to all of you for being here today. My welcome and my thanks. Our topic, as you just heard, is about founding teams, what makes them, what breaks them. I think we're going to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about both. And as much time as I can possibly allot to you is my objective. So with no further ado, what we'll do procedurally is ask each of our panelists to take a few moments to tell you about background, personal and professional, and current endeavor. And with that historical context, I will then ask each of them some questions on topic. And we'll start with Linda Ford.
Thanks, Joel, and I'll add my welcome to that. It's wonderful to see all of you. I got a chance to chat with a few of you beforehand, and there's lots of interesting stories in the room, so I'll be anxious to hear your questions later. Let's see, personally and professionally, where I am now is I have a business called Integra Coaching and Consulting, and I work with corporate executives as well as small business owners on the people side of business, which is everything from whether or not it's satisfying to you to whether or not the relationships in the company are producing profitable activity, which is the bottom line of the startup world, is can you get a team to actually create something that flies? And so it's the human side of that that's my business. I've been doing that for about 10 years. First 10 years of that was in Silicon Valley, and the last fourth of a year of that was in Austin, Texas. I moved to Austin in January, and so a lot of what I'm about now is getting my business resituated. I'm still working with clients here, I'm working with clients there, and I'm kind of on airplanes back and forth. Before that, I spent 15 years in technology companies doing the line side of work. I've been a software engineer, I've been in field sales, I've been in corporate marketing, product management, corporate philosophy. That was one of my more interesting titles. And all of that was in big companies. So I've never actually been an employee of a startup. But over the past 5 years, I've worked with a couple of dozen of them in this arm's length way that allows me to stay outside and yet be very much an insider. In terms of how I relate to clients with that, I think the most popular label that clients stick me with is their corporate shrink. So if that helps you kind of understand where I'm coming from. I am not actually a shrink, by the way. I have a PhD in human and organizational systems, which is sort of a blend of psychology and business stuff. And so my attention goes to the psychology of business, if you will.
A PhD in human systems has to be the same thing as being a shrink.
That's what the clients end up saying.
If anyone, when I was in the business world, said, you ought to consult a PhD in human systems, I'd take that as meaning you ought to see a shrink.
But look at me bad news, you know? All right, well, with that, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. My name is John Younger, and I am so happy to be here and also tell you that after a long and somewhat arduous journey, my company went live January 31st. Yes. Yeah, huge win. And I'm sure I'll probably be a poster child of founding teams that don't work. Give you a little bit of my background. I have a background in math and computer science from Notre Dame, and ended up competing at the Olympic level in the sport of rowing, which is in and of itself probably a genetic defect, but that's something that you and I can talk about later.
Okay, we'll take that up.
Started technically 4 companies. One was not in anywhere near this industry, and the first one was a consulting company. After I had worked for Bank of America in the systems engineering and software divisions developing, I stumbled into human resources, wrote an applicant tracking system, and they recruited me to be a recruiter, which is a really strange course. And ultimately, I ended up managing all of the staffing for the systems engineering and support divisions of about 16,000 people. So I had a large staff, had a great insight into both the systems technology as well as the people side of this business, and left that and had a consulting company. I made a lot of money, enjoyed it, but I really missed the idea of building something with a team, which is at the core of why we're here tonight. I wasn't passionate about building a consulting company. So I left that and started a company where we took recruiting. If you look at all the ways of doing it, contingency search, retained search, in-house staff, contract recruiters, applicant tracking systems, you took all the pros of that, stacked them together, that's what my company did. So we were a turnkey recruitment company. We started that in January of '96, and I sold it in November of '96 to a company called Trinet. I stayed with that company for the 4 years following that, and we were on Inc. magazine's 500 fastest growing companies all 4 years, which, as Gary and I were talking about earlier, basically means the company had lousy earnings before that. But I left that company in 2000 when I started Acola, my current company. And in April of 2000 is when the company formation did take place. And as we get through the questions here tonight, I'll be happy to tell you about how the founding team for that imploded and how we finally got to our successful release in January. And just to give you a sense of what a colo does, it's important to understand that, because it's basically the next evolution of how you're going to find your job with that person over there, which is we basically take everybody out of the middle and professionally facilitate the ability for people to find jobs that don't exist on any job boards, that don't exist on any websites, but exist in somebody's head and on somebody's budget. So to highlight that example, is there anybody in here who has a job they know is open, whether it's with their company or not? Anybody all know of a job that's open? Here's one. Hey, what's the job?
It's a marketing position in a friend's company.
And what level?
VP.
Okay. What kind of company?
Semiconductor.
Okay. Does anybody in here know of anybody, friend, acquaintance, that might be either the person or know of the person who could be a marketing VP at a semiconductor company? Okay. You have no way to connect up with her except now through a colo. And as a hiring manager, your friend doesn't want to sift through a bunch of stuff. So what we do is we apply professional expertise so that your friend simply points and clicks and Cola does everything else. But it's not a recruitment agency. It's simply facilitating people like you and I. So that's what a Cola does.
I'm Gary Alpert, and am a Stanford GSB alum from the class of '93. Went to Stanford undergrad as well. So I was a biology major, worked in healthcare for 5 years, and then somehow landed in business school, and met the founding partner of my company, Wet Feet, while I was here at Stanford. We did not start the company while we were here. We decided to start the company shortly after graduation. It was a year like this where it wasn't the best job market, and starting a company seemed like a pretty good alternative to not having a job anyway. So, and I actually went to business school to start a company, so the timing actually worked out well. I started a company with a friend that I made here at the GSB. We immediately formed a partnership after we left the business school, August of '93 or so. I guess we wrote up our partnership agreement. Actually spent about a year doing a consulting business to make money while we were figuring out what we wanted to do together as a company. Formed our company in October of 1994. It's about a year later. And officially launched the company in January of 1995. So we've been running it for a long time now. Wet Feet, how many of you have used Wet Feet in some way, shape, or form? This is the kind of market where lots of people in this room use Wet Feet. We have two different sides to our business. Ironically, we're also in the recruitment business. We have a consumer side of our business. We produce research on companies and industries for job seekers. So you can use Wet Feet to get the inside perspective on what it's like to work at about 1,500 different companies. And we work pretty closely with the GSB to get that information out to GSB students at no cost to you, which is great. We have another side of our business where we produce software and services for corporations to help them in the recruiting process. And it's primarily web-based software that runs the back-end part of a corporation's recruiting website and then the recruiting process. So a couple of different components to our business. And I'm happy to say that I'm still working with Steve Pollock, the co-founder of the business, and we continue to work together as a team running the company and growing the business, now 8 years later.
Why did you think Steve was a good partner here?
Well, this, in some ways goes against many of the things that I learned while I was here at Stanford.
Not in Joel's class.
Not in Joel's classes, because Joel wasn't here. But the most important thing was I trusted Steve like I would trust my own brother. And I knew that even if we went down in flames with whatever kind of business idea, it wouldn't be because of anything bad that Steve would do to me, that we would go in it with the best interest of having something be successful. And if it wasn't, we could, there was a high likelihood we could walk away and still be friends because of the fact that at the trust level, we trusted each other. And again, to this day, I think that connection has meant more than any other, part of the process that I could add to it. The fact that in the face of when good things happen, there are lots of things to celebrate, and you rarely think about kind of the personal qualities of your founder or your co-founder as being part of what you celebrate when good things happen. When bad things happen, it's very natural to think about, well, what did he do or she do that was wrong? If they hadn't done that, things would have gone great. When we face adversity and challenges, we do it as a team. And it doesn't mean that we don't have differences of opinion and come to loggerheads all the time, as you do in any relationship. But I've never had a situation in those kinds of conversations to this day where I've had any questions at all about trust, integrity, and kind of the key issues that form our relationship both professionally and personally.
Well, you were here and talking with Steve about starting a company together. Did you analyze your skill sets with a view toward whether they were overlapping or different, whether they were complementary, or was that not something that it was not something that you analyzed at all, but rather this was a good guy, he was a good friend, and we were going to start a business together?
No, we did, and it was actually there are a couple of folks here who know both Steve and I, so they'll laugh. But it was the reason why I almost didn't start a company with Steve, because I knew that we were very different people, and I knew that that was good from the perspective of things that I had energy and passion around and was good at would be different than the things that Steve was. And so as a team, we could be more than a 1 + 1 = 2. We could be 3. And when you're starting a company, it's really good to have 3. The other part of it was I knew that I was signing on for something that was going to be really frustrating and challenging of our personal relationship and trying to start a business and adding that dimension to it. Because, just as an example, Steve is a very detail-oriented, more conservative type of decision maker than I am. And because a lot of the work that you're doing in the beginning of starting a company is that higher level, visionary, risk-taking kind of work, I was concerned of what I was signing on for. I think that at the end of the day, the reason that I did it was because I was afraid of my own tendencies, and I knew that it would be good to have somebody to balance me out in that way.
Was one of you the lead entrepreneur right at the outset? Was one of you the CEO, or did you start off in an egalitarian, we're partners, we're co-CEOs? How did you?
We started out in an egalitarian context.
And when did that change?
That changed. That actually did not change fundamentally until 5 years later.
That's pretty good. Notice I didn't say, did that change? That was very intense. I didn't know the answer. In fact, I don't know the answers to any of the questions I've asked. Okay? But that was going to change. Okay? That's going to change. So if there's any pedagogy to this methodology, I'm trying to identify some of it as we go along. That was going to change.
Part of the background of the company that I didn't mention is that we bootstrapped the business for the first 2 years. Did 2 rounds of small angel financing in the first 5 years, and over the last 2 years have done 2 major rounds of venture capital. Or, for us it's major in the context of some of the things that have gotten done. It's not as big, but we've raised just about $16 million over the last 2 years from major venture folks. And it was at the time that we were doing the first of those large rounds that we formalized our roles with a title of I'm CEO and Steve's president. And functionally what that means is that I focus on more of the external parts of the company, and Steve is focused more on some of the internal management issues.
I'll get you off the hot seat in 1 second and move to some of your colleagues here. But one other question. Did you talk about at the formative stages when you were thinking about starting a company with Steve, did you talk about a divorce procedure? What if 9 months later this isn't working? What if one of us wants to continue and one of us doesn't? What if one of us wants to fire the other? Did you have any conversations at the outset about how you would deal with things going badly between you?
We actually did. I'm really glad that you asked that question because I feel proud that we did. And
I'm amazed that you did. It's very impressive that you did.
I think that
obviously you went to Stanford Business.
That was something that I absolutely did learn while I was here, and in fact, I mean, one of I think, it's a kind of an inside scoop that you guys can appreciate, but by far, I always say the most important class I ever took at Stanford was touchy-feely, and it was because of touchy-feely that we would even think about, the worst case scenario before we even started. It also happens to be where we got some of our investors. So there's a very real connection between, the facilitator of Steve's touchy-feely group is an investor in our company. So there's a very tangible connection. But we intentionally set up a process for ourselves where before we talked about specific ideas and did the idea brainstorming, we wrote a partnership agreement. And we actually didn't know what we were getting ourselves into when we did that. And the first time we saw all the things we had to talk about, it's actually very much like the process that I'm going through right now with my wife in setting up a trust, because we had a daughter, and you have to set up a will, and think about all these worst case scenarios that you don't think about day to day.
Who's the guardian? Most people don't do a will. It's not going to be your sister I'm leaving the kids with. No way. And so since they can't agree on a guardian, they don't do a will. And that's actually what you're saying is very, very important, because when you then say, if you have the insight or the education, and hopefully both, to realize, you got to talk about things that might go bad, not just things that might go good. So we ought to have some agreement here. You go to a lawyer. The lawyer outlines all the things you have to discuss. You're about to start a partnership with someone. I don't want to discuss all these unpleasant things about what if we hate each other 9 months from now. I mean, we're not going to hate each other, right? We wouldn't be doing this if we're going to hate each other. And the lawyer says, listen, you came to me, you want this agreement or don't you? But that's the point of the agreement. And a lot of people say, you know what? No, we don't. In fact, most people at that point say, no, we don't, because we say, well, it's not going to happen. And then you're back to where you were before you had the insight that we need to deal with these things.
Exactly. So I think the fact that we went through that, we actually learned a lot about each other that we didn't know either, because it's when you have those difficult conversations and you're going to disagree on many of the things in the beginning that you start to see, how does this person behave when there's a disagreement? Can we get to some kind of conclusion? So, and again, it also has, for us, that same kind of conversation in many different forms has recurred as we've been growing the business many, many times in different contexts, having to talk through bad news and planning in order to make sure that you're thinking about the long-term best interest of the company.
Thank you, Gary. Now, John, you started with a co-founder, and he is no longer with you. Is it he?
That's right.
And he's no longer with you. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
This is the most recent one with a colo. Prior to that, when I started Winet, I had a co-founder that was successful. Just so I have some success.
Okay, we established it was your partner's fault.
Okay. Yeah. So I started this company on this idea that basically broke the rules around a lot of things that people had hard-coded in their brains. Applicant tracking systems were what he's developing, what Gary's doing on the backside software side. Community, a Craigslist is in and of itself unique. All these other things, and it ties back to the partnership, because what I found is that there were very few people who could understand the complexities of merging these things in a way that was systematic and that would allow us to really leverage this to scale. And so this particular partner I had found through a mutual friend, and he is brilliant. He's probably one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. And he got it, and he helped expand it a little bit, in some cases a lot. He's a systems development kind of a person. And at the onset, that looked like a great alignment, because here's somebody who can take what we're doing and build a technology construct around it so I don't have to spend as much time doing that. So from the role standpoint, and very much like Gary, we had talked about the worst case scenarios. And part of the way that I approached this was that he was a founding partner, but he was not an equal partner. I've seen and worked with, in the course of my other companies, worked with probably pushing hundreds of companies, if not well into hundreds, where I'd seen equals implode because of the equals. It's better if there's accountability in a way that there's always a final decision maker. So I followed that theme when I formed the co-op. Where I missed, and this is bad for anybody related in the recruiting business, but where I missed is I didn't take the touchy-feely class. And what I missed was, attitudinally, he was somebody that operated in a way that was so functionally different than the way I operate, and in some ways the way we needed the company to operate in terms of rapid prototyping. Let's get something out, let's try it, let's beta test it. And he needed to have $24 million and a large staff before he was ready to get anything out the door, which I didn't know up front. And it drove down to an attitudinal component that I had missed and that he had missed, because it wasn't pleasant for either one of us, and it certainly wasn't a joyride for him.
How long did it take for these differences to surface, and how long did they fester, and how did you deal with them?
Well, you ask easy questions. I think in retrospect, and again, I suspect that both Linda and Gary have the same, maybe it's a genetic level defect, is that we're overly optimistic. That's part of what drives us. That's part of what makes us want to push something to the envelope that others don't see, because we believe it's there, even though there aren't any tangible data points that necessarily tell you that right now today. And so we started this in April, and it was very clear he had brought on other people that he knew, which was sort of a domino effect, because in some ways they were of the same mindset. And so I found it becoming very polarized at this, no, go out and raise money, John, you need $24 million, what are you waiting for? Versus what can we rapid prototype? Let's show that this works. And it started to really rear itself within the first, I would say, 6 months. And it started to become very evident that our approach to life was so different. Not the jump in, let's try it, let's expect that it's going to break, let's fix it, let's tweak it, let's learn from it, let's research as best we can. And he was much more safe. And I'm not saying there's a better or worse way, too. I'm going to make sure I'm really clear on this point. There is not necessarily a better or worse way. I think for starting any company, you have to have a certain degree of what I call scrappiness. And I don't know if there's a class like that in Stanford. There should be at Stanford. It's that battle bot that has, Dad's old saw blades in it. It works because of sheer willpower. And it was 6 months into it that it became very evident that he could not produce anything that we could take to a client and say, try it. He could come up with ideas all day long. He'd come up with all sorts of action plans and lists of things to do and budgets and projections, but he couldn't actually produce anything in a short amount of time without 30 or 40 people around him. And it took another 3 months, and we finally decided to amicably say, this just isn't a fit.
And just give us a little more context to who initiated that. I mean, how did that happen?
It was really mutual. It was also very evident. This is at a time when we raised seed-level funding from some strategically incredible people and companies, and that was phenomenal. And it also became clear that with the really dying, the flaming out, the otherwise crashing and burning of companies in the recruitment space, that any possibility of funding that Gary was going to get, that I was going to get, evaporated. The reality was that just there was not going to be any money. So it was obvious that I looked at him and I said, you have to live without pay if you want to go down this journey any further. And that was like an easy decision point for us.
That's one way to fire someone.
And I was doing it myself, so it wasn't one-sided. It was like, this is the nature of the course. If you believe in this, you'll do it, and if you don't, let's just figure out where this makes sense to divide.
Thank you, Linda. Before I ask for you to address, what one should look for in partners and members of founding teams, tell us a little, based on your experience, the typical issues that you've encountered dealing with founding teams, and then we'll work backwards from that to see if we have some generalizable principles that follow.
I guess one of the most common issues is what you're describing of just fundamentally different work styles. People come into a venture like this often with sort of an expectation of, oh, the way I think must be the way everybody thinks, especially if they haven't been to touchy-feely. They've done touchy-feely, it's different, but if they haven't, then there's not that awareness. And so I met with a woman this afternoon who just finished off a company about a year ago, and for them the experience was kind of the opposite of yours, which was, which was that they were very different in styles and figured out how to leverage that to a strength. So one of them was leap to the prototype, leap to the decision, and the other was, let's analyze this, let's think about this. And they learned to let that push and pull. But that's a big divisive issue. The second issue is maybe harder to put into words. It's having a relationship where the relationship has its own complexity before the business, and you can't kind of get your feet out of the mud. So if you're, best friends since the high school soccer team, that can work to your advantage, but it can also be enormously challenging because you bring a kind of an intimacy to the business that's hard to work with the executive team. So that can create its own kind of issues, is having two founders who have too much of an attachment, a closeness to each other. I guess the third on my list would be the whole thing about trust. I'm astounded by the number of founding teams that I see where the people basically don't trust each other's intentions. Why are you doing this together? That one just doesn't make sense to me, but it happens a lot. And so I think it perhaps happens so much because it's really hard to gauge. It's very intangible. It's, even beyond touchy-feely, it's just really, a very intangible thing. And so you launch off because all the analytical stuff fits. You're an engineer and I'm in marketing. Won't that be a great partnership? You're really fast-paced and I'm more thoughtful. Won't that be a great balance? And then there's a neglect for something just doesn't feel right here. So I think trust is a really huge issue in founding teams. That's sort of the you can't fix it. Don't bring me in to fix that kind of problem. You can't fix that problem. You can dissolve the partnership in a more productive or less productive way, but you kind of can't fix it.
Well, let's probe that a little bit, because if on the one hand there are dangers in starting a business with a good friend or a spouse or someone with whom you are very, very close, because there's all sorts of other emotional ties that have nothing to do with the business at play, and as you mentioned, because that sort of sets you apart as quite different from anyone else that enters this endeavor. And so there are risks in doing it with a friend, with a spouse, with a relative. But on the other hand, how are you going to learn whether you can trust someone who's a stranger? So, presumably you're much more likely to know if you can trust your best friend from high school than someone whose resume impressed you. And conversely, you may have great functional need for the skill set, the experience of the person who you just met and decided to start a company with based on that resume, but you would have no way of knowing if you could trust that person in any really deep sense until you got involved and started a business with him or her. So where do you come out on that?
Okay. A couple things. First, I'm going to back up to your presumption. That's kind of more lawyerly of me than normal. But the presumption that you can trust this guy because you were on the soccer team together in high school and you've known each other ever since. There's a quality of trust there that's, of course I trust you, we grew up down the street, but do I trust that your intentions are in sync with mine? And that's a big place people trip. So even if I know you quite well, in the heat of adversity in the business context, I may stop trusting that you have the same good intentions that I do.
So it's less an integrity point, which is obviously a separate point, not unimportant, than it is a shared vision point, that we're actually doing this for the same reason. That we're, I thought we were in it for the long haul. You seem to want to build a company we sell 9 months from now. I thought we were going to own this thing 99 years from now. So it's a sense of, gosh, we didn't work out that we have a shared vision in terms of what our objectives are.
or even a shared way of thinking about how we operate a company. So it can be either integrity or just we're on different tracks and I don't trust that we're kind of going the same direction. And I think, to your kind of end question of how do you prevent these issues, what do you do to get things off on the right track, some sort of a dialogue that's beyond what's our product, what's our market, where are we going to get our money. I mean, those are important questions. I don't mean at all to say don't answer those. But the kind of conversation you would get into in a partnership agreement, for example. In my mind, the value of the partnership agreement is 99% the dialogue that you have. Because you'll ask each other questions, you'll find out, how does this person deal with it when I say, you're nuts, I'm not doing that. Okay, let's find that out now before we sign. And so the dialogue that you have around the substantive issues of your partnership through a written agreement or whatever is the best way to do that. We joke about touchy-feely, but I was a touchy-feely facilitator about 10 years ago, and one of the reasons I think that produces these great partnerships is because people have had a depth of dialogue without having had to go to high school together or be married or whatever, They really get to the depth of, can I know you as a human being and partner with you at the level of two human beings partnering, not just at the level of co-investors in a company.
Okay, so we've identified then in those comments the notion, and starting off with a co-founder or co-founders, sharing a vision, identifying very clearly the objectives, long-term and short-term, talking about the integrity issues, the sort of moral principles of doing business with people, those people being suppliers, customers, employees, all the various stakeholders, investors. Approach to the business, a business plan issue, which is really what I hear you talking about, John, is really a business plan issue. Are we going to raise $24 million, build it, and hope they come, or are we going to do this more incrementally, piece by piece, and having some sense of how we're going to build this business be something that's been identified early on and that all founders are on board with. From these things, what would any of you have, go down the line to say about, just the generalizable principles of how do you engage with those potential co-founders, these kinds of discussions to elicit the information that you'd want in these areas? Do you have any sense of that?
A couple of thoughts. I want to add a really important one to your list of things you might want to have a dialogue about that came out of your reaction to at what point did you clarify your roles. We all knew there was a point where that had to have happened sooner rather than later. So one of the first conversations, I don't care if there's 2 of you or 9 of you, you're not all the same job in the company. And so let's begin to distinguish. You're the outside face, I'm the inside face. You're the engineering face, I'm the marketing face. I care less that you put a box around it and say you're the CEO and you're the president, and more that you've had a real conversation about what the roles are early on. That conversation to the how point, I think, begins to frame the others. Because now that we know that you're the outside face and I'm the inside face, then these other conversations kind of have a natural form to them. And inversely, you mess that part up. I worked with the founding team for a while where they never could get that answer straight. They agreed one was CEO, one was president. That's progress. But they could never get straight whose job was whose. Right. And so they were always either on top of each other or so far apart that the enemy could drive a Mack truck through it. And so
I think another area where I think people get hung up is on the idea. The only thing that you know for sure when you're starting down a certain path is the idea is directional, but it's wrong. It's an idea, and as you gather data and learn, it may be great, but it's not, the idea is not the business. So spending too much time up front or as you're running the business on the idea and being wed to that and not carving out time and structuring time for the other kinds of things that are part of building a business is those are the things that you end up down the road cycling lots of time through and having to solve. So just as an example of a couple of areas that, again, I'm just thinking back through 8 years, I think that one of the areas that is really important to just go deep down, come up with some ideas about it, and then revisit it again, 3 months later, 6 months later, are all the issues around money. Which, probably in retrospect, Steve and I didn't spend enough time talking about up front, and so it did create some problems down the road that we had to resolve at that time. But everything from how are we going to pay ourselves, how are we going to pay other people in the company, and what kinds of, is that going to be okay with you for, just 6 months or a year, or, thinking through all those kind of compensation-related issues is really important, because obviously at a personal level, that's important to people, and also, going through the process of building a company, people are developing personally as well, and so what may be okay for me today may not be okay for me a year from now, because things have changed in my life. So kind of thinking through those kinds of things with money, I think money is always something that can drive a huge wedge between people, and those kinds of conversations can be very difficult. At the same time, I think they're very important. Another one is the decision around roles. And in fact, again, just to show it never goes away, I have to, leave here right after this is over to go back to work, because we're going through a process with our management team where, we're doing an exercise we call hats and heads, that we do every single year, where we forget about the hats that we're currently wearing in the company, and we just think about all the roles that need to get filled in the company, and then think about how we might shuffle the deck again, given either resources we have internally or things we need to go outside for to fill, given what we know about the business today. And we structure that discussion, stick it down on the calendar in advance, because if we don't structure it, we never have the discussion. And then bad will builds up, the business starts going in a direction a little bit too long that it shouldn't be going in, and you haven't fixed a problem. So those are two specific kinds of call-outs, I think, that are really important to talk about up front.
I think those are excellent comments. I'd simply add on the idea stage, by far, most often the success of an enterprise will depend much more on the strategy and the execution than on the original idea, which is precisely the point Gary was making, because the idea is a direction and it ends up getting morphed and changed and adapted, and you have to, in fact, be enormously flexible to do all those things. But at the time you're sitting down with your potential co-founders, the highest value is actually placed on the idea. And it usually goes in a conversation along the lines of, we're talking about money, we're talking about equity, and we're talking about titles. And there's usually someone in the room saying, well, wait a minute, it was my idea. And at that point in time, nothing's more important, because you don't have a strategy and no one's executed anything. And that often leads to tremendous frustrations later, because what turns out to be important actually wasn't in that living room that night the idea, because the business actually ends up looking very different than that idea. It ends up, the contributors turn out to be the people, could be the person with the idea, might not be, who conceived the strategies and the barriers to entry and the execution and built the management team and did the technology and all the stuff that isn't what you're talking about in that first meeting when I'm going to be the boss, you're going to be the so-and-so, I'm going to have this much equity, you're going to have that much equity. It's all around the idea. And so, again, we teach a lot of cases about these founding arrangements, and they're really wonderful to sit in on, because very few people have done it anywhere near as well as Gary. Very few. In fact, we should do a case on yours that actually sounds you did it right, as opposed to all these incredible cases on great companies, I might add, who've done it all wrong, as well as some wonderful cases on companies that never made it because they did it all wrong. And a lot of what they do all wrong is just that. They don't realize, a year from now, this conversation would be very different. And build in the flexibility so that it's actually easier a year from now to have that conversation rather than almost impossible. And that's what we hope when you go to Stanford Business School, you actually learn how to do this different than if you were out there, as I was, doing this without the benefit of a business school education. I'll let you come back, make some final comments, and then we're going to the audience.
Okay, one of the concepts that was etched indelibly in my experience was something I call track shifting. And it is something that really speaks to 3 different levels of my relationship with you as a co-founder. The first is, how quickly do I have an idea, change an idea, and then have another idea and change another idea? Because it's one thing to sit in a room and brainstorm. Basically, now everything's fair game. But once we head down a path, how many horror stories have you heard about visionaries or CEOs that every week they're driving their company a different direction? So their track shifting is a very real sense. So the second thing is how to communicate that. So if you think about this at a basic personal level, Jason and I might be founders together. he might be the guy that needs to stay on a course for at least 6 months to really feel like he's making progress in life or in the company. I know as a CEO, we have to be incredibly flexible. So what that means is we're going to be partners, that we have to together determine a path that he can stick on that's going to help us as best we can anticipate, and that we don't change his track frequently, because that's where he gets destabilized. The third level is around how we manage those shifts. If I know that Jim is a guy who can sit there and brainstorm with me just real easily, that if I come to him tomorrow and say, you know what, I think we should do this instead, he can go, okay, fine. Well, I know that there's a comfort level to be able to do that with him and not cause him severe heartburn. Now, conversely, if Jason doesn't do that, I have to understand how best to communicate the shift to Jason, and I may have to do extra work about how I phrase it, about how I frame it, about how I present it, about why. Maybe he needs to know the whys in more detail than Jim. Jim gets it, he's cool with it, that's fine. But Jason needs to really understand the why. So those three concepts around this fundamental concept of track shifting I found to be really important. I missed that with my last founding partner, is that he needed a 12 to 18 month straight shot. And doing this was completely unnerving to him, and ultimately increased his stress in ways, and mine, in ways that were just flat out unnecessary if I had understood that concept then.
Thank you. Let's go to your questions now. I'm going to have to repeat your question just so that the audio portion of this videotape captures it. Otherwise, it won't. So bear with me. I'm not repeating the question because you didn't state it well enough. I'll try to repeat it exactly. Go ahead.
You talked about the importance of trust in relationships, and I wonder whether you could talk about whether or not there were breaches of the trust, and if so, how did you overcome that? And I think sometimes people breach trust and they don't know that they do it. They don't do it intentionally, and sometimes they do it intentionally, but they really feel like they'll never do it again. And I'm just wondering if any of you guys experienced that, and if so, how did that process of kind of healing from that happen?
I don't really have to repeat that. Are you catching that audio up there? Are you all right with that? Good. Go ahead and answer that. I mean, my repetition would be, okay, what about trust?
I've got to think through that one before I answer it, so I'm going to think about it a little bit more.
I mean, it's a tough question. I mean, how do you hey, trust is all important. What happens when there are breaches? Isn't that basically what you're saying?
One of the things that I've seen that's one of the more tragic versions of that, if you will, is that trust gets breached and the person who experiences the betrayal doesn't say anything, and the other person never does know that they've really sinned in a big way. And you can't get onto the healing part, if you will, until you can at least have both people know that what's happened. So I think that's one of the most important things, is that if something happens in your partnership that you feel like is a betrayal of trust or a breaking of an agreement, you got to bring that to the table. And of course, it takes a certain amount of trust to do that. So you're in a hard cycle there. But if you don't bring it to the table, you can guarantee it's going to blow up. And the other thought about that is what a mentor of mine years ago said about credibility. He said credibility is really easy to establish. It's much harder to reestablish. Trust is the same way, of course, and so that's where your partnership and all that background work that you did, hopefully, comes to play, is are we willing to put in the hard work to reestablish the trust at that point, or do we split it?
I actually want to piggyback on that, because I think that's so core to a founding team, and that is this idea that how you and your co-founder or founders relate around this issue will set a tone throughout the entire organization. Now, management, at best, is like trying to herd cats. So, if you don't establish this kind of clear, responsive, respectful way of dealing with breaches in trust right from the get-go, it'll be a seed of disaster somewhere in the organization, because other people start talking behind each other's backs. And I think that, Linda, your point is right on, which is if you feel like it's been breached, if you don't have the level of confidence and trust with each other to bring it to each other, then fundamentally there's a problem. And if you do, then you should. And I think in doing that, it goes back to the things that Gary discussed around what are those hard to discuss topics that you have to keep driving to periodically, just as a gut check.
I mean, I think one of the reasons that's such a tough question is because it's such a tough answer. I know I think that when there's a breach of trust, while it's certainly not impossible to repair, I think it's very, very difficult to repair. And it sure takes a lot of energy away from the mission of the company. And I met with every new employee at our corporate headquarters personally the entire 20 years I was a CEO, and said basically the same thing, which is you'll never be fired for making a mistake. I make them much more often than I'm ever going to admit to you. We all make them. But you'll never get a second chance on integrity. If you're dishonest, you're going to be fired, and you're not going to get a second chance. And I think that's one of the cultural values you have to establish in a company. And I think it's usually far better if you do that at the outset, and you live with it, and you enforce it, because it's just a lot easier than trying to repair breaches of trust if they're even reparable.
And usually the ones I think that are reparable aren't actual integrity issues. They're mistakes that got misinterpreted. They're things that I thought happened and didn't really happen, or vice versa. And so those are the reparable kind. The integrity kind, you just kind of go away. But the mistake kind still can cause a breach in trust. And I mean, I certainly see more broken founding teams than whole founding teams, because most people don't call me unless they're in a lot of pain. So I've seen a number of these where the underlying reason that I get brought in is I don't trust him anymore, and I can't tell him, so I need to tell you, and then you need to make it better, which is kind of the marriage counselor version of the corporate shrink. But that is a part of sometimes the kind of broken thing that I get asked into is, okay, what do we do with this now?
I think just in kind of thinking through it, I definitely agree with everything that both Linda and John have said. And there's nothing that jumps out for me as being an integrity or trust level issue that has ever come up with with the co-founder of the company. It certainly has come up with various employees over the years, and Joel talked about core values, and I think that one of the interesting things about trust and integrity is that it's one of the things about our company that I'm the most proud of, that everybody in the company knows that Steve and I trust each other, and that is such a core value of the company that people know that's the way we do business. It's different than how it's different than how other companies do business. It's different than people's experience in working with other companies. And for employees that value that kind of trust and integrity, they're going to be attracted to that kind of work environment where it's that explicit. It doesn't mean that there aren't issues that come up all the time, and there are. And one of the things that I think my partner is actually better at than I am is in saying, hey, we really should go out and grab beers and talk through some stuff that I'm thinking about. Because again, if you don't address the things when they're just disagreements or little things, they're going to kind of only escalate over time. So taking time out for that part of the process is important. But the areas where we have had issues, it's inevitable that you're going to run into. I was naive in thinking when I started a business that people will all kind of play by the same code. They don't. And even people that you trust in the beginning, things will happen inevitably. It's all part of the experience, and how you react in those situations, I think, also sends a message to the other people in the company about what trust and integrity means at your company. Do you act, or do you tolerate things that are very visible to other people?
Yes, sir.
Looking at a company
Speak loudly, please.
Looking at a company from an advisor or investor perspective, and you see two co-founders, one of whom does not really contribute anything that you see. There's no real value added there, and we want them to resolve that issue. But the stronger partner has blinders on and is just not able to confront and deal with it on their own. What do you then do? Do you send them to the psychiatrist?
No.
But you said you're asking the question from an investor perspective. So this is different than internal to the management team.
Yeah.
So presumably the management team doesn't agree with that analysis or doesn't want to buy into it.
is afraid to confront it. Doesn't really want to deal with it.
How bad do you want the money?
Well, no, the money's in, as I get the question, right? I mean, this is an investor sitting on a board of a company. There's 3 founders, and they think one of them's not pulling his or her weight and really isn't adding much value, and they'd like the other 2 to get rid of that person. This happens a lot, by the way.
They're you're an advisor, and they're going to raise another round of money, but you see this one co-founder as being a real liability, and they have a lot of equity in the company, and it's not going to look good to.
Yeah, this happens a lot. So, John, your question I may have misunderstood is: do you want to please your investor, or do you want to please your partner? Right. Any thoughts? You've probably seen this before.
Yeah. What flashed into my mind is there's not a very happy ending to that story in most cases. One scenario is that you're wrong and the guy actually adds enormous value. So, I guess thought one for the investor would be open to the fact that you're wrong and that there is some value there you just don't understand yet. Assuming that's not true, which most of the time I think it's not. It's just one thing you ought to be open to. Assuming it's really true that, George just doesn't add value to the team, then what you're wanting to do is help the other investors see that. So you're going to want to get data in front of their nose. Here's the specific facts, whatever that you can see. You're going to want to create some way of having some shared experience of the problem. So if this is at such a small state that the investors and the co-founders all still get in a room together, then you can create an experience where you can later go to the guy who doesn't see the problem and say, how about George's participation in that conversation? Does that fit with adding value? So you're creating shared experiences as opposed to just reporting data. You're trying to create knowledge where none is wanted. And any of you who have taught know that that's kind of hard to do. Taught or parented or managed or, any of those things, right? If you want to create knowledge in the person's head and they really don't want to have it.
By the way, it's a great question that invites lots of discussion. This happens a lot. I happen to teach entrepreneurship here from the perspective of the entrepreneur, because that's where I come from. There are other people who teach courses here from the perspective of the venture capitalist and institutional investor, and they are very different perspectives. I faced this with a significant institutional equity investor who actually came to a conclusion that one of my partners and co-founders wasn't needed to the business, and put tremendous pressure on me to deal with that. And that, to me, went to core values, went to why I was an entrepreneur, went to the fact that this guy was a fraternity brother of mine in college, and I saw in him and in his ability something that investor who came by, for quarterly board meetings didn't see. And there was absolutely no way I was going to get rid of him. And I will say that, he succeeded me as CEO of Hyatt Legal Plans when we sold it to MetLife. He's doing a great job. He's a great guy. And I told the investor to pound salt. But this happens. And a lot of it has to do with, why are you an entrepreneur? How did you assemble that founding team? What are your core values? And how badly do you want to cater to the money? Now, I can promise you there are a lot of people who teach here from the venture capital point of view who would say that everything I just said was heresy. You've got to please your investors. That's where the money comes from. And so, again, I'm not suggesting right answers. I am suggesting that a lot of understanding how entrepreneurs will behave in that situation goes to understanding many of the issues that we've talked about in the last hour here, and how you're going to approach those kind of issues of trust and why are you doing this and how did you pick your partner and what loyalty and bonds do you have to each other.
And that's a great what if to have in these are we going to be partners conversations. Let's walk down that road before we form the partnership. What if it's you we're talking about? What if it's me we're talking about? How would we handle it?
There's another data point, and some people may highly disagree with this point. And that is that I would submit that most founding teams are not the right team at a future stage of the company. And it speaks to what is your methodology as a founding team to evaluate each other's effectiveness at that company at that stage. One of the things that's killed more than a few companies is the founding person saying they're going to take it public and they're going to stay with it, and they just simply don't have the skills, the experience, the contacts, the wherewithal to pull that off. That's not where their strengths are. So it's a good question because it also raises it to another level. which is maybe all founders at some point should probably get out of the way. The question is, how do you evaluate when you get to that point?
And what your thinking is on this set of issues can have a lot to do with how you're going to build your company and where you're going to get your financing. Because my last comment, notwithstanding in terms of how I dealt with that, much more through emotion than intellect, and certainly not through training or education, notwithstanding that answer, by and large the reality is if you are going to go out for institutional outside capital, equity, institutional capital, meaning it's not from Aunt Tilly, it's not, it's from someone who's got fiduciary obligations to manage that money. What you've really decided when you brought that capital in is that now it's about the success of the enterprise, and that's different than your personal success. Now, a lot of people become entrepreneurs because they want to control their destiny. It's a lifestyle issue as much as anything else. I don't want to work for anybody. I want to work for myself. Well, if that's why you became an entrepreneur, you should build a company that without ever going out for institutional capital. Because once you've done that, you are making the statement that all decisions now get resolved in favor of what's best for the entity, whether they may or may not be best for me at all. In fact, they may be awful for me. Maybe you're out of a job because that's what's best for the entity. So that's something to think about. As you're putting together a founding team, it goes to what shared vision do the founders have. It goes to what kind of company you're going to build. It goes to how are you going to build that, and certainly how you're going to finance that. And these all tie together. It's why when you sit down as a founding team to address these things, the more of them you address, the more prepared you are to face the inevitable challenges that lie ahead. Yes?
You've talked a lot about the two founders. My question is, how do you expand that membership to include your larger team? I'm thinking about a couple clients I work with where there were 2 or 3 founders, and even years after starting, they still run everything, and the rest of the management team feels disempowered. And then kind of a specific thing for you, Gary, you two of you take touchy-feely, you have this kind of like code of how to speak. Were you able to bring in the rest of your team to that way of working?
I think that those are both very good questions. The question around how do you bring in more people, for us the reality was that for the first few years of the business we were not ready to bring in other people. We really didn't have the capital to make it work for people. We would have basically been asking them to sign up for disproportionately for the vision part of it, when the vision part of it was evolving very, very rapidly. So we kind of made, we were pretty deliberate about when we thought it was the right time to bring in somebody. And we also were pretty deliberate about understanding that when we did, the day that we did, we needed to make the decision about who calls the shots. Are we still calling all the shots, or are there certain kinds of shots that we are going to defer to a manager? Because the whole reason that we're bringing in these higher level folks theoretically is that so we can focus more of our time doing the things that we do well, recognize the things that we don't do as well, and bring in a pro to run that part of the business. So I think that, I don't know the specifics of the situation of the company that you were referring to, but it sounds an awful lot like, I think it's pretty easy when you create a company to think no one knows as much about the company and the history and where we've gone as I do or we do because we're the founders, and so no one else is going to make, I can't trust anybody else to make the right kinds of decisions. For us, for whatever reason, I think it may have been as much fatigue as anything else, but we were ready to have, wouldn't it be great to bring in a great VP of sales, a great head of operations to do these things that are extremely time consuming for us. We're not the best at it. We didn't decide to be entrepreneurs to do these jobs, and by letting somebody run with it 100%, we're going to achieve better results, is just kind of a way that we've, I think, been able to do an awful lot more. I think the other piece of it, again, and I do think that there are different models that work, but we've used a model that does distribute significant power to our VPs, and we let them run. And the cost of that is that it introduces a lot more process.